Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Wachter. I'm chair of the Department of Medicine. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Today is this kind of big experiment to do to go hybrid, and I'm thrilled to see the folks here in the audience who are enjoying a fabulous meal. I'm trying to entice some of you who are watching remotely to join us in the future. But we will do this hybrid for the foreseeable future, maybe forever, and hope that some people choose to come. We have food, we have Apex access, we have phones, and we have camaraderie. But those of you who are watching on Zoom, that's terrific as well. So welcome to everybody. A couple of ground rules. Grand Rounds will continue in this mode, hopefully as long as we can, at least through the end of June when we take the summer off, and then we will start again in September, again in hybrid mode, probably moving to the brand new conference room and the floor of the C building. CME is available. The instructions are available to those of you who came here, as well as they will be available online. Q&As, if you're here, we will ask you to ask a question. You may have lost that muscle, but hopefully you'll be able to resurrect it here in the room, and we'll mix it up with questions that people are asking online. Lakshmi is monitoring the online crowd as well. And I think that's it in terms of ground rules. It's lovely to see all of you. From the standpoint of masking, the university's rules as we understand them now are that in a non-clinical area, which is this, you're allowed to keep your mask off. It's recommended that you keep it on, and I think that's certainly a prudent thing to do. I will do that, but obviously if you're eating or drinking, it's awfully hard to do with the mask on, so feel free to go ahead and do that. Our speaker today is Pam Ling. Pam is professor of medicine and director of the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education here at UCSF. Luckily for us, Pam is the epitome of the UCSF stands for You Can Stay Forever. She did, and she has, coming here for medical school, residency, research fellowship, and joining our faculty now 20 years ago. Her research focuses on tobacco, media, social marketing, and young adults. Her work includes the analysis of previously secret tobacco industry documents, documenting industry marketing strategies, and she has really a special interest in sort of how does the industry, the tobacco industry, use marketing tools and techniques to get people to use their products, and what the implications of that are for public health, and to push back on some of that in the appropriate time and place. She's principal investigator of the UCSF Tobacco Center of Regulatory Science, one of 9 such centers in the country, funded by the FDA and the NIH. She's contributed to 3 Surgeon General reports on tobacco, and she's a member of the American Society of Clinical Investigation, one of the prestigious honorary research societies in the United States. She's also an active clinician in the Division of General Internal Medicine. For those of you that play trivial games, this is useful, so you should keep it in your back pocket. Pam was on MTV's The Real World in 1994 while she was a third-year medical student, and she met her husband while being part of that television show that went on for like all year, right? They were filming everything. Maybe you can tell us a little more about that. Anyway, her talk today is the end of the tobacco epidemic within reach? Pam, welcome. Nice to see you.
Great, thank you, Bob. I never know when people are going to glom onto the fun facts or not. So the talk today is not about being on the real world, but maybe if we have time for questions, we can chat about it. So I like to just start, since we actually are here back in person on the land, to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We're proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support. We look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. I also wanted to thank the Tobacco Center folks for being here, my mentors, collaborators, an army of postdocs, our funders from the NIH, FDA, and TRDRP, as well as our partners. I do study, as Bob mentioned, I study marketing. So I'm going to show you a bunch of marketing images, but I do not endorse the use of these products. Okay, the learning objectives today are for you to get an understanding of the changing landscape of tobacco and nicotine products in the US. We're going to touch on the latest evidence on e-cigarettes, safety, cessation efficacy, and health impact. And then we're going to talk a little bit about policies and their potential impact on tobacco use. Okay, so why care about tobacco? Tobacco is responsible for roughly 1 in 5 deaths in the US every year. That comes to about 480,000 deaths. It's still the leading preventable cause of disease and disability and death in the US. The good news is that smoking rates are coming down. So here's a helpful graph from the internet that shows that, in the 50s, smoking rate was about 50% and has decreased dramatically over the past half century. And the latest national data estimates that the smoking prevalence in the US is about 12.5% in 2020. However, we know that the whole population of the US is not evenly distributed with regards to smoking. And so here in California, our smoking prevalence is around 11%. But you can see from this map from CDC that the smoking prevalence is much higher, and sometimes in some places double that in the Midwest and southern parts of the US. We also know that globally, tobacco is not distributed evenly. So overall, global smoking prevalence is also decreasing, but that's not evenly distributed across the globe. As you can see from the map, there are warmer areas and cooler areas. And then the total number of smokers due to population increases continues to increase overall. And you can see from the map here the parts of the world where the numbers of smokers are increasing most dramatically. And this is why there's still a market for cigarettes. Okay, this is grand rounds. So we're gonna have a case. This is a case, this is a 55-year-old male who's got a spinal cord injury and chronic leg ulcers with poor wound healing and a current smoker. In the past year, he's reduced smoking from about 10 to 2 cigarettes per day, but he's pretty resistant to quitting smoking completely. He says, I'm basically not smoking anymore, and I already tried everything. But today, when he's in the clinic, he mentions he started using an electric cigarette. So how do you respond? You could say, great, millions of people have quit smoking using e-cigarettes and you can too, go for it. You could say e-cigarettes are just as dangerous as cigarettes, don't do it, throw that thing away. You could say, have we talked about the Fontana Center? Now, if you're at UCSF and you do not know what the Fontana Center is, you will know by the end of this talk. Or 4, you could say, what's an electric cigarette? And that may seem like a silly question, but it's actually not that silly because it's really changed dramatically. So for those of you who want to use this helpful schematic from the Surgeon General's report, most e-cigarettes have these basic components. They have a battery, they have an atomizer which heats liquid, they have a chamber or a cartridge that contains the liquid and a mouthpiece. The heating produces an aerosol which is then inhaled. However, e-cigarettes have changed dramatically. So when they first came on the market, most e-cigarettes looked like little cigarettes. And then the second generation e-cigarettes looked a little bit more like pens. The third generations were called box mods. They got larger, bigger power, more adjustment. And now with pod vapes, you have just a tremendous amount of variety of looks, shapes, sizes. Most of the time, these e-cigarettes don't even look like cigarettes at all. They look like other household items. It can be very confusing. They can sometimes look like this, dramatically different from a cigarette. These look like bottles. E-cigarettes are still available in a wide variety of flavors. And they also will continue to position themselves sometimes as very un-cigarette, right? So chic, technological, or different. So from a clinical standpoint, though, we always have the same basic questions when you're seeing the patient, right? One is it safe, right? And the other question is, does it work? So I'm going to, even though this is not my research, I'm going to go through the evidence on that. So you will know what to say. So the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, formerly the IOM, Institute of Medicine, did a very comprehensive review of the evidence on this, published in 2018, looking at short and long-term health effects. However, it's been observed, and with a quick search on dimensions, I verified that there have been a lot of papers published since 2017. In fact, most of the papers published about e-cigarettes have been published since the IOM cutoff, so there's a lot more evidence to review. Just this month in Australia, they actually did a worldwide systematic review and really took all the existing international reports and reviews, including the National Academy report, but also Public Health England, review from Ireland, reviews from other parts of the world, and then did additional, what they call a top-up search for the literature. So they added additional studies that have been published since then. They also did a very rigorous grading for the quality of the evidence for their analysis. So what I'm going to present to you today is a little bit of the National Academy's report plus some Australian upgrade. So the first question is around nicotine delivery and addiction. Right. And what they found is actually there is substantial evidence that for non-smokers, if you use e-cigarettes, it can result in symptoms of dependence. The evidence for this is also true for smokers, but a little bit less robust in terms of evidence. And there's some evidence, but though it's limited, about abuse liability. So how addictive is the product? It's generally thought there's some evidence that the combustible cigarette is the most addictive. E-cigarettes are a little bit less than combustible cigarettes, but there may be more abuse liability than nicotine replacement therapy. So one way to think about this is this old kind of classic article in the New England Journal of Medicine from Nancy Rigotti that maps out for you the delivery of nicotine over time by different products. So the cigarette, which I've enhanced with the red line, is illustrating this very rapid delivery of nicotine to the brain, right? And that is why we think that cigarettes are the most reinforcing and the most addictive product. If you look at the other lines on the graph, like the gum or the nasal spray even, or the patch, those deliver more slowly, and so they're felt to be less addictive. Some of the e-cigarettes, especially the newer devices with nicotine salts, have been found to deliver nicotine as rapidly as cigarettes, although there's also a lot of variability between the products, so not all of them do, and it depends on how you vape and how deeply you inhale, et cetera. So high nicotine products could be a good thing, right? If a product delivers a lot of nicotine rapidly, it could mean that it's a very good substitute for a cigarette, right? If you're trying to substitute with something that doesn't deliver nicotine as well and you're really addicted to nicotine, you're going to find those other products less acceptable. The downside of high nicotine products is, of course, they can be really addictive, right? And so if kids are using them, they can rapidly get exposed to a lot of nicotine, and that can be a problem. The products, especially the new products, also contain a lot of nicotine. So the Juul, which is the most kind of famous pod vape cigarette, one pod of the Juul was estimated to have at least the equivalent nicotine to about a pack of cigarettes. And then some of these newer products are now coming in really large sizes. So this Flume product is, instead of having 200 puffs, which is like a Juul, it has like 3,000 puffs in it, which is just, it's a whole lot of nicotine. So if you're not really aware how much nicotine you're getting and you're using a new product, and you're a young person, you might be exposed to quite a bit. Okay, that was nicotine and nicotine addiction. We're going to move on to cardiovascular and pulmonary health effects. We certainly know that from cigarettes, right? Cardiovascular and pulmonary health effects are something we're really concerned about. The evidence in this area is still developing. There's not really studies that have this direct evidence of cardiovascular outcomes like heart attacks, stroke, or atherosclerosis directly related to e-cigarettes. But there is a fair amount of evidence looking at these more intermediate outcomes like blood pressure, arterial stiffness, or endothelial function. And in smokers, e-cigarettes are found to increase blood pressure, stiffness, and to decrease endothelial function. There is also some limited evidence showing that if smokers switch completely from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, over the long term, they have lower blood pressure. So that's, again, an intermediate marker that looks kind of promising for switching. With regards to pulmonary, similarly, there's very little evidence that actually has this direct evidence of pulmonary outcomes related to e-cigarette use. The evidence was very clear around EVALI, which is this e-cigarette or vaping associated acute lung injury. This was an outbreak that happened in 2019 that was really felt to be mostly attributable to THC containing e-cigarettes, especially if they had vitamin E acetate in them. But with the quality of the evidence, it was pretty clear that those products were associated with this lung injury. But with regards to other pulmonary symptoms, the quality of the evidence is still being accumulated. There is some evidence that was graded as insufficient, again, saying that if you switch from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, some respiratory measures, intermediate measures like spirometry may improve a little bit. With regards to exposure to toxins, the National Academy's report was really clear. They said there was conclusive evidence, and the Australian review agreed that e-cigarettes increase your exposure to particulate matter indoors, so fine particles. There's lots of exposure to fine particles. They also found that from the National Academies that if you completely switch from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, you can reduce your exposure to toxicants from smoking. And there was also they felt substantial evidence that this complete switching from smoking to e-cigarettes could reduce some short-term health outcomes like reduced blood pressure, as mentioned, COPD exacerbations. So overall, you do get exposed to toxins. If you are usually smoking and you switch completely to e-cigarettes, you're exposed to fewer toxins. But we don't really know evidence on the health outcomes of that. Finally, with regards to safety, the Australian Department of Health looked for all these other health outcomes. They did find there was conclusive evidence that e-cigarettes were associated with potentially could cause burns or explosions. They can lead to nicotine poisoning, which can be severe, and the nicotine toxicity like seizures has been reported. However, there's still really no or insufficient evidence on these other health outcomes that we're really interested in, but we're still trying to figure out. So cancer, reproductive health effects, mental health effects, and all these other systems outcomes basically all had either no evidence or really insufficient evidence. So then the next question comes, well, does it work, right? It's safety, there's some safety questions, but do they actually help you quit smoking? The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, which is a primary care provider, always looking to see what they recommend. They updated their recommendations in 2021 and still say that the current evidence is insufficient to assess the balance of benefits and harms of e-cigarettes for tobacco cessation. And they actually recommend clinicians direct patients who use tobacco to other cessation interventions with proven effectiveness and established safety. Now, this may change. So this is not U.S. Preventative Task Force. This is the Cochrane review. So there has been this Cochrane review that came out in the end of last year that, again, very rigorous and did a review of the literature and did find that in their meta-analysis that nicotine-containing e-cigarettes were superior to nicotine replacement therapy in randomized controlled trials. And they estimated about 3 more people for every 100 who attempted using e-cigarettes would quit compared to NRT. They also found there was some moderate strength evidence that nicotine-containing e-cigarettes are superior to e-cigarettes that don't have nicotine in them, and that nicotine e-cigarettes were superior to usual care or just behavioral support. They also noted that there were very few serious adverse events in the randomized trials, though most of them follow smokers for about 6 months. And this review only looked at randomized controlled trials or uncontrolled intervention studies. So they didn't look at the observational data. So here's an example from this Cochrane review, looking at the 4 randomized controlled trials that compared nicotine e-cigarettes to NRT, and their risk ratio there was 1.53 favoring e-cigarettes. It's also worth mentioning that Ricky Wang here at UCSF has also done a meta-analysis that included both the RCTs and 35 observational studies, because e-cigarettes are not all used under randomized controlled trial conditions. This is a product that is widely available on the market, and most people who use it are not using it like you do in a randomized controlled trial, right? You're buying it at 7-Eleven and just getting started. And so the vast majority of the observational studies have found that there's no benefit for e-cigarettes. Some of them have found that the people who use e-cigarettes are less likely to quit smoking. And certainly when he did this very extensive meta-analysis, he found there was overall no benefit. So what's the bottom line for e-cigarettes and smoking cessation? Is it's still not FDA approved for smoking cessation, still not recommended by the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. In some places, the UK especially, they are recommending using e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, but most countries do not, and nicotine e-cigarettes are still banned in about 30 countries. I believe that they may be helpful to increase smoking cessation if you can do it under randomized controlled trial conditions, which means physician supervision, everyone receives counseling and support, and it may be better than NRT. But if you're using them, as most people do as a consumer product, there is no benefit. So if we get back to our case, what would I do with my patient? One is, I think you would always support the patient's efforts to stop smoking, right? So if e-cigarette is the reason why he went from doc, don't even talk to me about smoking, to like, well, maybe, because I'm going to use this electric cigarette. That's at least opening a conversation which is worth pursuing. I always explore when people say, I tried everything, what that really means. In his case, I tried everything meant he tried all over-the-counter nicotine replacement, right? So he tried the patch, he tried the gum, he tried the lozenge, but he had never actually tried varenicline, or he never tried bupropion. So there actually were other options for him. Now, if the patient was like, I don't want another pill, I want to use my electric cigarette, what would you do? My recommendation then would be, based on the literature, to encourage complete switching. So most of the people who use these cigarettes continue to smoke cigarettes sometimes. And you really want to encourage this patient to completely switch over to the e-cigarette if they can, to keep their indoor environments smoke and vape free. So don't like vape in the house. We know that the toxicant exposure is quite high, particularly indoors, and that will also help them with their cessation journey. In addition, they got to secure the liquid because there's poisoning risk, and you don't want their kids or their pets to be drinking the e-cigarette liquid. And then for me, over the longer term, if they're able to quit, I would still encourage them to switch over to approved nicotine replacement over the long term, just because we don't know really beyond 6 months to a year what the health effects are going to be. And then you keep the conversation going, right? If you're having a conversation with your patient about quitting or vaping, at least if they have new symptoms or if there's new science, you've got a channel to talk about that. So the flip side to cessation of this course initiation, the National Academies did also review the evidence on initiation. They did find there's substantial evidence that for never smokers, right, e-cigarette use increases the risk of ever smoking. And then if you are a young smoker and you use e-cigarettes, that increases the frequency and intensity of subsequent smoking. So there is an on-ramp as well as an off-ramp. The Australian review also took a look at all the papers published about e-cigarettes and smoking initiation and did a meta-analysis and added all the additional studies to the National Academies report, came up with an odds ratio of about 3. So about 3 times the odds of initiating smoking and current smoking among never smokers who use e-cigarettes. So these are high quality, mostly longitudinal observational studies. And you can't randomize people. So I have a second case for you. This is a different patient, a younger guy, 23-year-old male. He started using e-cigarettes when he was 19. He's currently vaping about every hour for about 13 to 15 hours a day. Also vaping cannabis every 2 hours. Also has symptoms of depression, has lost 20 pounds. And he is coming in because he's interested in quitting vaping. And he says he has tried countless times. So what would you recommend? So one thing you could do is you could say, have you heard about the Fontana Center? So the Fontana Center is UCSF's tobacco treatment center, located here, run by Suzanne Harris and Lisa Kroon. Their approach to tobacco cessation is what they call relentlessly supportive, and they're actually known for providing state-of-the-art cessation support over a really long time for patients. They also have completely converted over to Zoom meetings and telephone during the pandemic, so you can participate in these groups smoking cessation support from your home or from your phone. And so you can always, there's a smart phrase in Apex. I can instantly do a referral to Fontana, or you can just Google Fontana Center at UCSF and this will come up. Similarly, there is the California Smokers Quit Line, which has now rebranded themselves to kickitca.org. And if you can't remember that, we used to have the Smokers Helpline 1-800-NO-BUTS. But as in California, we've recognized that we've moved from smoking to a broader array of tobacco use. The Quit Line has also rebranded to address more forms of tobacco. So again, the easy thing to do is just Google California Quit Line. This is the first website that will come up. And in addition to having the phone calls, they also offer web services, texting services, live chat with somebody on the web. And as you can see, they also offer support for not just quitting cigarettes, but they do offer support for quitting vapes and other forms of tobacco. If you're a young person like my 23-year-old, you can also, the Truth Initiative has developed a free texting program to help people quit vaping. And basically you can text Ditch Juul to this number, and it will basically sign you up with a chat bot, text bot that will give you support for vaping support. This is free. They've also published a randomized trial showing efficacy for this texting program, and very accessible for young people. Then if you want to be on the cutting edge, you can think about work that Danielle Ramo and I did together with support from the Cancer Center, which was taking Danielle Ramo developed smoking cessation support groups on Facebook and held them on Facebook. And then with support of the Cancer Center, we adapted the program to be on Instagram for teenagers and to address vaping. And that's because teenagers are not on Facebook anymore. But this is sort of the look and the feel of the Instagram cessation group. And again, these take place, there's a little different than like a chat bot or a text, because you actually join a group that's run by a trained cessation counselor. And then you get Instagram posts 1 to 3 times a day over the course of treatment that give you tips and support and tricks to quit vaping. And the idea is to basically create a safe space for teens to get support around vaping and no judgment. So this program is actively recruiting right now our randomized trial. And so if you go to quitthehitca.com, any teenager aged 13 to 17 in California who's vaping and on Instagram can enroll in this trial. You will be randomized either to the Instagram groups or to the California Smokers Helpline, Quick at CA. So you will get evidence-based smoking or vaping cessation support either way. But if you want to help us out, you could do that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the future, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions, Bob. There are more things coming out. A couple things coming out you might hear about in the future. I just want you to be aware of them. Heated tobacco products have actually been around since 2014, and they've actually been around since the 90s, where tobacco companies tried to sell these things and they fail every time because they're weird, but they're trying again. Philip Morris has introduced this product they're calling IQOS, which basically uses this heater, and inside the heater you insert this little mini, what looks like a mini cigarette. It actually contains modified tobacco, so you can't just stick your cigarette in the heater. It's special. And then the heater produces an aerosol for inhalation, but it doesn't quite light it on fire. So the idea is when you heat this up to high enough to produce the aerosol, that it's safer than combustion, because you should avoid combustion products. the FDA actually authorized marketing of this product in the US as a modified risk tobacco product. So the company was actually allowed to say this product heats rather than burns tobacco. And if you switch completely from smoking cigarettes to this product, you decrease your exposure to toxicants. So they were ready to do this. But the pandemic was happening, and then R.J. Reynolds and British American Tobacco started challenging the patents. And so right now, the International Trade Commission has shut down import of this product, and it's on hold. But Philip Morris International is still selling this product all over the world. They say they're in 69 countries worldwide, and I think they're poised to get this one out when they can. Nicotine pouches are another new product that you may see coming out. So this looks kind of like smokeless tobacco, but doesn't contain any tobacco. It just contains binders and nicotine in a porous pouch. And you stick the pouch between your cheek and gum like you would smokeless tobacco, and it delivers nicotine across the mucosa. All the tobacco companies have one of these, and there are some other independent ones, but the Zyn product, which had the biggest market share, is owned by Swedish Match. Velo is a nicotine pouch product owned by R.J. Reynolds, BAT. Drift is another one, I think now acquired by R.J. Reynolds and BAT. Rogue is independent, and they're doing their social media. And Philip Morris has one called On. So these pouches, again, kind of weird, do deliver nicotine. We don't have a lot of data on the safety, but there has been some concern that especially teenagers who got caught vaping might switch to these because they're so subtle and easy to use, but we do not know. I also wanted to raise your attention, nicotine gum that is not being sold as NRT. So this is an example. This is Lucy gum. This is what they're calling chew and park. So it is used like nicotine gum, but it comes in pomegranate and other flavors. And they're really selling it like not for smoking cessation. They're just saying this is for smokers, who want to get their nicotine some other way. Another interesting thing that this brand is doing is they're selling nicotine gum and nicotine lozenges and pouches. And some of these products, like the lozenge, is actually equivalent to the FDA-approved smoking cessation lozenge. And it comes with an insert that talks to you about smoking cessation. But the gum and the pouches are not. Those are just like out there. And when you put them all under the same brand, I think that, people just kind of start to think of things under the same brand in the same way. So it'll be kind of easy to think about these other products as probably like smoking cessation, even though they're kind of not marketed that way. And of course, we're concerned that they might sell the products to use when you can't smoke and potentially increase your exposure to nicotine. Along with this change in products comes what the industry is pushing as a change in its own image and how we think about the tobacco industry. We wrote a commentary about this a few years ago called the pharmaceuticalization of the tobacco industry. And you can kind of see it in the new products that come out looking more medical. They look more like medical devices. They seem to have, more controlled dosing. The companies are going for government certification like the modified risk tobacco products and seeking to maybe renormalize nicotine use in this kind of cleaner, safer way. As Bob mentioned, I actually do a lot of research using tobacco industry documents, and I don't have time for that, but this is one example of an industry document from 20 years ago where Philip Morris Tobacco Company was thinking about their future and, as a leading cigarette manufacturer in the lower left here in a declining market and projecting that one future pursuit could be to be more like a pharmaceutical company, a nicotine pharmaceutical. And this pursuit of safer tobacco products and repositioning of themselves as a harm reduction company is really in line with that. The other concern around this is that the companies will seek to really just normalize use of nicotine. This is a helpful pamphlet from British American Tobacco they put out about a decade ago explaining nicotine. And the pamphlet includes this comment that, nicotine as used in the doses is really not more risky than having caffeine in your coffee. So we wrote a whole paper about how the tobacco companies really try to make an equivalent between caffeine in coffee and nicotine, as opposed to likening nicotine to heroin or other much more dangerous and addictive drugs. So I mentioned Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, which is the other major company in the world, is also fully in on these new products. So this is like some of their shareholder information, which includes vapor products, heating products, and these oral pouch products. So the major tobacco companies are really in this space. The other space they're entering is funding. So Philip Morris International a few years ago established a foundation for a smoke-free world. This is a foundation that funds research on smoking cessation and tobacco harm reduction. And when this came out, there was a much made about Philip Morris pledging $1 billion, right, to fight smoking. And, we all love funding, but for me, the tobacco companies, both creating a problem and selling the solution is really an ethical conflict of interest that we need to be paying attention to. It kind of reminds me of the Dr. Seuss book, The Sneetches, right? Where you have the Sneetches, the star-bellied Sneetches and the plain-bellied Sneetches. And the ones with stars felt bad. And then this guy, Sylvester McMonkey McBean, came by, and he had this machine that would solve your problem. And the Sneetches cycled through one machine versus the other, putting on stars and taking off stars while Sylvester's made a lot of money. And I worry about the tobacco companies creating the solution and the problem and profiting from both. Conflict of interest is also something we really need to pay attention to in the literature. This is a systematic review we did of all the published literature on tobacco harm reduction. And what we looked at was whether you had a financial conflict of interest in the study and your stance on whether you were supportive of tobacco product promotion for harm reduction or if you were skeptical. And the top line here is the studies that did not have any conflict of interest were about 50-50. About 50% were enthusiastic about tobacco harm reduction, and the other half were skeptical. But if you had support for your study from an e-cigarette company, a tobacco company, or a pharmaceutical company, you are much more likely to be very supportive of promotion of tobacco products for harm reduction. This isn't the most studies in the literature, but it's just enough to tip the balance from even to a little more in favor of tobacco harm reduction. Other future trends we're thinking about is, which I do not have time to talk about, it's a whole other talk, Bob, is what we're calling the triangulum. So with legalization of cannabis and the proliferation of vaping, and the fact that you can use the vaping devices to use both nicotine and THC, I think we're going to see increasing. We already see a lot of co-use between tobacco and cannabis and vaping. And as cannabis is legalized and as vaping nicotine became really popular, vaping cannabis also became really popular, and again set the stage for things like the vaping-related lung injury, which was related to cannabis vapes. So something to watch. Okay, so the title of the talk is about ending the tobacco epidemic. So I have 5 minutes to tell you how we're going to end the tobacco epidemic, and are we going to get there? No problem. So, I showed you a whole bunch of fancy tobacco products, and you get depressed, and you're like, oh my God, they have so much money. What do we do? There's conflict of interest. But I do think it's good to think a little bit about what we have achieved. And we can feel particularly enthusiastic about being here in California, right? Because we have achieved great success, right? We have like the second lowest smoking rate in the nation. Our smoking rate's like about 6.9%. And Steve Schroeder told me yesterday, if you like control for Utah, the Mormon factor in Utah, we would be the best. Our youth smoking rate is less than 2%. It's extremely low. And it's not the youth tobacco use rate because we use a lot of e-cigarettes, but the smoking rate's very low. The California Tobacco Control Program started in the 80s, with a 25-cent tobacco tax, was the first in the nation that created a tobacco control program from the tax. And in those 30 years, this program has saved 1 million lives. We've had lung cancer decreases twice as fast as the rest of the nation. And Jim Lightwood here at UCSF did an analysis which estimated it saved $500 billion in healthcare costs. So we have achieved a lot. However, as I mentioned in the very beginning, right, the success is not evenly distributed across the population in California. And this is tobacco use, so it's not just smoking prevalence, but our overall tobacco prevalence is about 12%, according to the California Health Interview Survey. But it's higher in some groups, right? So young adults have higher rates than the rest of the population. Males have higher rates. Sexual gender minority groups have higher rates. And then African American or Black and Native Americans also higher rates of tobacco use. And this is, as we've brought the overall prevalence down, we really need to put attention now to the groups that are potentially left behind. This is not, in addition, we see disparities by education, by income. SPD is serious psychological distress. So as you remember, my 23-year-old has serious psychological distress. This, the work that Steve Schroeder and the Smoking Cessation Leadership Center that has done really focusing on tobacco treatment into mental health setting is really critically important. Very high rates of tobacco use in this group. And rural areas, right? Rural areas of California are also left behind. So what can we do? There's a few things we can do. Many of the groups that are left behind disproportionately use menthol and flavored tobacco. So policies that will end the sales of menthol and flavored tobacco will help with disparities. Most kids start with flavored tobacco products, and we know that menthol is just everyone kind of has heard about targeting the African American community with menthol. But other people of color, particularly Pacific Islanders, also disproportionately use menthol. And it's also some of the data that we have disproportionately used among sexual and gender minorities. So getting rid of menthol can help to address this disparity. Valerie Yerger here at UCSF is a national leader, probably an international leader in this area, has worked for decades around getting rid of menthol and other flavored tobacco. San Francisco, this is a picture from when San Francisco was one of the first cities to completely end the sale of menthol and flavored tobacco. And not long after that, the governor in California also signed a policy to get rid of menthol and flavored tobacco. Now, the tobacco companies forced a referendum on this. So this will be on the ballot this fall, and we'll see if this holds up. But this is an important policy. A second kind of cutting edge policy is thinking about just getting rid of tobacco altogether. So this actually came out of some communities where they were talking about getting rid of menthol or getting rid of other flavored tobacco. And people would say, you know what, if this is so bad, why not just get rid of it altogether, just end the sales and ending commercial, we use commercial tobacco sales so that it doesn't include traditional tobacco use in Native American populations. There are actually 2 communities in California have already done this, right? So Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach have already voted. And, you know, Armageddon didn't come. And at least for proof of concept that you can end commercial tobacco sales in your city, it has happened. And part of this is just setting a goal, right? And not everyone's ready to end commercial sales, but having the conversation about it is something that folks in California and other parts of the world are having, and getting away from just we need to control this to we need to end it. In New Zealand, they say they want to get below 5% in 2025. Another policy that aims at ending tobacco sales is tobacco-free generation. So that's saying like after a certain date, right, you can't buy tobacco anymore. So then like if you were born after the year 2000, you can't buy tobacco. And so then that generation from then on is tobacco-free. Interesting idea. They're thinking about it in some countries. We could do it here. I don't know if we will. And then this is the plan for tobacco control in California. I think the main thing here is really as tobacco prevalence continues to go down, we need to keep our eyes on the prize. We need to really pay attention to the populations that are potentially left behind and invest in them, right? So we really need to promote equity. We need to promote diverse voices. We need to put money into those communities. And then we also need to continue to keep our core principles around preventing youth from starting, protecting people and the environment from exposure, both to secondhand smoke and to waste from tobacco products. We really need accessible, effective, affordable cessation resources for folks. And then we do need to continue to try to reduce the industry's power to spread disease and death. And in doing so, I believe we can achieve the end of the epidemic. I am super grateful to having had your attention for this time and look forward to it. So thank you.
Thanks, Pam. That was terrific. Let me start out with a couple, and then we will open it up to both folks here and folks online. When the world was just cigarettes, it was pretty simple. You know, those of us who cared about public health were against them. I'm trying to figure out what our position should be on e-cigarettes, because you've made arguments that we should be against them. You should also hinted at potential arguments that they have saved lives, that they have lowered the amount of smoking, assuming they work as substitutes. It sounds like the evidence is a little bit uncertain, but is the world with e-cigarettes better or worse than a world if there were no e-cigarettes?
That's a good question. It's complicated. It's complicated. I think the product. It's very difficult now to say like this product is bad. It should be gone. And even cigarettes, right? When the industry came out with light cigarettes, we originally thought, light cigarettes are potentially a good thing. People should switch to them to quit smoking. I think with e-cigarettes, it depends a lot on who the audience is. In some ways, that's why it fits for me to study marketing, because maybe they are helpful for some smokers who cannot use any other way to quit, and if they don't stay on them for too long, and they're probably a really bad thing for young people who wouldn't take up tobacco in the first place.
And as a gateway, why are they a gateway? What's the path by which someone starts with e-cigarettes and then switches to cigarettes? Because I imagine they could have just started with cigarettes, and maybe it's seductive to start their jazzier products and they're newer. But why does someone then make that transition as opposed to finding the e-cigarette satisfying and this is the product they're going to use forevermore?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the evidence is observational, so we don't particularly know the mechanisms. We do have some interviews and qualitative data that talks about these transitions. One thing is that the amount of nicotine delivered by e-cigarettes is still super variable. Mm-hmm. So not all of them are efficient, whereas cigarettes are pretty consistently efficient. And so if you become dependent on nicotine, it's easy to learn that that's a more efficient way to get nicotine over time. I think that's potentially one reason. The other potential reason is that cigarettes are still super easy to get and they're widely available.
Are they cheaper?
So they can be. It depends, again, on what you're buying. But it can be like the amount of, for some of the newer devices, you have to lay out more money up front, whereas, cigarettes are pretty cheap. So there may be financial things. And then I don't know, the concern we have with kids is sometimes that even if you're starting with like a non-nicotine e-cigarette, if you kind of learn the behavior of when I don't feel good, I need to reach for something and vape on it, probably not the greatest kind of coping mechanism to kind of get used to. And that behavior might be easier than to translate to other drug use.
One more question, then we'll open up. I'm a little confused about nicotine versus toxins versus tobacco versus other stuff, in terms of if it was a pure play that e-cigarettes just delivered nicotine and it solved the addiction problem or substitute addiction. Is nicotine bad for you, or is it just bad for you because it's addictive? When you smoke tobacco, is that nicotine plus a bunch of other stuff as an inherent property of tobacco, or is somebody putting in nicotine? And when you say that the toxins fill the room, does that mean there's a secondhand smoke problem from e-cigarettes? So just sort of, can you disentangle these various chemicals so we understand what the risks are?
Yes, there are lots of chemicals. So you're right, there is nicotine. And I think when e-cigarettes were first sold, people kind of thought they were just nicotine and maybe kind of vapor. And it is also true that when you burn plant material, it produces a lot of combustion products and lots of chemicals and toxins. E-cigarettes are probably fewer chemicals and toxins than burning plant material, but they don't have, actually do have high levels of fine particles. And, you know, we all follow PM 2.5 since the fires. So the fine particles do have toxic properties and are not good to breathe.
For other people, secondhand.
And both for yourself to breathe in, and they can have secondhand exposure. Yes, and then getting addicted to nicotine also, you know, though some might say that's not a big deal, I think it's a big deal and I wouldn't recommend it.
Big deal because it's an addiction, or big deal because nicotine itself is dangerous?
Because it's an addiction. I think at high levels, you know, nicotine is neurotoxic and causes seizures, can be a poison.
But in terms of all the cardiovascular and lung cancer and all of that stuff, does nicotine have any role in that, or it really is all the other stuff?
I think we are mostly thinking that at least the data from long-term NRT use is that nicotine seems pretty safe, but you're usually comparing it to smoking, right?
Okay, great. Any questions or comments people have?
Yeah, and say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Alan Treadwell, primary care general internist. Several years ago, there was a lot of excitement about a potential addiction vaccine. And I don't know if that's still, you know, I haven't heard anything about it for a while. And I don't know if that would even play a role in tobacco addiction. But do you know what the status of that is, or what role it might play?
I don't know. Do you think folks can hear? Yeah, there are mics here now. Okay, so with the addiction vaccine, the Pfizer one, the Moderna one, what do you?
Yeah, I agree. There was like a lot of excitement about that for a while. I have not heard anything new about the addiction vaccine lately.
What would it do?
I don't know.
Some receptor that nicotine's glomming onto. Interesting. Yeah.
So no news, I guess.
No news. Right. All right. Yeah. That's it. Say who you are.
Oh, I'm Nader Najafi. I'm one of the hospitalists. I was wondering, it felt like a lot of what you were describing, the FDA is green lighting all of these new, am I mistaken that the FDA is approving all of these new products for the purpose of smoking cessation? I'm kind of getting to Bob's point of like, so that's the excuse is that all these products are necessary. We have to be so creative for smoking cessation, and the FDA is saying, yes, all of these products are for smoking cessation because there's no other benefit, right? It's clearly just a harmful substance. Is that the idea? So it just feels a lot like enabling. Does it not feel like the FDA is sort of greenlighting a fascinating new industry of promoting this?
Yeah, well, the FDA actually has only approved one e-cigarette for smoking, and not for smoking cessation. So they've actually only approved a limited number. What happened was e-cigarettes came on the market before before they were regulated, and there was a long legal battle to get regulations in place. And so then you have all these products that are being sold and get grandfathered in. So the FDA does endorse this idea of a continuum of risk for tobacco products, and I think does have some enthusiasm for e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, but they have not approved all the products for smoking cessation.
So they just approved them as approved them.
They're allowed to be sold. They're allowed to be sold, you know, the FDA is cracking down on flavored products, but they are in a tough spot where they are trying to balance out, you know, very strong arguments that smokers need access to some alternatives to smoking cigarettes versus the real concerns about youth use. But I would say they're still not in the FDA approved category.
Great. Okay, I think Lakshmi has a question from Zoom World.
Zoom World questions. So we have questions from the residents at the general. They say, do you think that some of the effects of the RCTs about NRT might be mediated by difficulty of patients actually using the right dose of NRT?
Okay, so it is true there's only 4 randomized controlled trials that compared in e-cigarettes to NRT, and it is possible that, you know, the e-cigarettes everyone got some support. The e-cigarettes were given for free on some of the trials, and it wasn't clear how much work they did around dosing the NRT. So it is true that at the end of the largest trial, they found that most of the e-cigarette users were continuing to use e-cigarettes, and almost none of the NRT users were continuing to use NRT, which could suggest that they weren't using the right dose.
We have another question online?
Yeah, so Dr. Schroeder asks about, you're good.
Oh, I'm good. You're-
Yeah.
Okay.
You need that.
All right.
These mics pick up this
So
on.
I'll figure this out.
We're all figuring it out. But Dr. Schroeder asks about, can you comment about the use of the smokeless tobacco snus in Sweden and how that impacted smoking rates and what can we learn from that?
So some of the people who are very enthusiastic about tobacco's harm reduction talk about the Swedish experience, which is Swedish snus is smokeless tobacco that has low levels of nitrosamines that is quite popular in Sweden. And so the rates of tobacco use in Sweden have less smoking and more smokeless tobacco use. And
Meaning you chew? What-
yeah, like
what's
chewing
this?
tobacco, yeah. The Swedish snus is put like, it's not like our typical smokeless tobacco in the US. It's more kept in the upper lip and it's pasteurized, so it has lower levels of toxicants and nitrosamines. But some people are enthusiastic about it for that reason. They say in Sweden, they have less smoking because they're using smokeless tobacco. And the concerns here about oral cancer are felt to be not true in Sweden because they use this low nitrosamine product. There was enthusiasm about smokeless tobacco or snus here in the US, but the product sold by RJ Reynolds as Camel snus is not necessarily the same as Swedish snus, and I think it hasn't really caught on.
Pasteurized, okay, good. So another hand up somewhere, John, say who you are.
John Mon, I'm General Surgeon, past chair of TRDRP. I think to answer your question, Bob, I think a better world would have been if e-cigarettes had only been available through pharmacies with a doctor's prescription rather than sold widely. But Pam, there is a goal of achieving the tobacco endgame by 2030 in California through the Department of Public Health. Just wondering, do you think the pandemic is hindered? What is your observation of the connection of COVID and smoking?
Thanks, John. So John points out, one, that it would have been better if e-cigarettes were available by prescription. I actually agree with that. I think the marketing of the product and the wide availability is one of the big problems, not just the punch itself. Second comment was that in California, there's a goal to get to the end game by 2030. And his question was, does the pandemic affect that? I think, yes, the pandemic affects that. If you talk to our community partners about ending tobacco, a lot of them are, just like the rest of us, right? Really overwhelmed by all kinds of other things, pandemic related. And, there may have been some temporary decrease in tobacco use, especially like while kids were home with their parents, they couldn't be vaping from school as much. But overall, I think the levels of stress that folks are experiencing and just the amount of burden on communities right now is extremely high. And so getting to those goals can be really difficult with a lot of competing priorities.
And just to clarify, so the goal, let's say 2030 is the goal, tobacco free. Is that the idea that it's not sold below a certain age or not sold anywhere, or are e-cigarettes part of that goal, or the goal really is focused on cigarettes?
No, I believe, John, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's ending sales of commercial tobacco
Start. Yes,
in all of California.
to begin.
Including e-cigarettes.
And
Yes,
then
e-cigarettes are tobacco products under our definition.
I agree. One last question.
There's a follow-up question from Dr. Soren at the General just on that. How do you balance the gains from eliminating commercial sales of tobacco with harms we see when other substances are prohibited? For example, underground markets, et cetera.
Yes, this is a common, the complaints you always get is like, why are you gonna ban tobacco when you can, get cannabis everywhere? Or are you gonna create a giant illicit market? I feel like I don't know how we balance the gains. I just feel like in California, we are really, really close to getting to the end. And we probably don't need a whole bunch of fancy new products to get there. And we may create some illicit market, but I think what we've learned so far is that when you give people the opportunity and you make it easy for them to leave the product behind, many, many, many do. And we should try to go for it.
Pam, thank you for all the work you're doing in this area. Really, really important. Thank you for a terrific talk. Thank you for folks who came. And thank you for folks who followed us online. We'll put this on YouTube in a couple of days and look forward to seeing you back next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob.